Good Tuesday morning to you, my friends. This morning, I want our Tuesday tune-up to be about knowledge. Now, knowledge, you probably have noticed, can be kind of a funny thing. We spend a great deal of our time trying to acquire it so that we can both cope with the world and make a life for ourselves. We're told knowledge is the key to life. You've heard these phrases: knowledge is power, it's a gateway, it's something to which we aspire. Well, this is, of course, true, and knowledge is often a very good thing. It's one of those things that we tend to put up on a pedestal. Every one of us has had some level of formal schooling, from tiny children in preschool to high school and beyond. Our society places such a value on knowledge that we actually use public funds to offer every child the opportunity to attend school. We go even further and we create institutions of higher learning, which are in some ways modern temples to knowledge. And yet, and you knew there was sort of a but here, yet there are times when knowledge fails us. There are times when knowledge can actually get in the way of real learning. Paul talks about this to the church in Corinth when he speaks of what he calls the God of the world. In fact, there are many gods of this world that we create: money, power, status. But knowledge can also be one of the gods of this world. For knowledge can create certainty, and certainty often leaves little to no room for other things. Differing thoughts, opinions, new ways of looking at the world, these can all be crowded out by the certainty that knowledge brings us. We know that the world is a certain way, so it can be hard for us to imagine any other way that the world might be. But for all of our pursuit of knowledge, there are other ways the world might be. Jesus teaches the disciples this time and time again. Think about it. We know that you cannot restore a blind man's sight or a deaf man's hearing by simply touching him. We know that you cannot feed 5,000 people from 5 loaves and 2 fish. We know that the dead cannot come back to life, and yet Jesus did every one of these. And in each case, he challenged the disciples to see the world in a new way, to rely less on the certitude of their knowledge. Jesus was constantly challenging the disciples to look at the world in different ways, to rely less on what their knowledge told them and more on what God was in fact providing. Sometimes Jesus, even in his humanity, even got a little bit impatient with the disciples. Mark's gospel tells us 2 stories of the feeding of large numbers of people. The second time around, when the disciples rely upon their knowledge and tell Jesus that it's impossible to feed such a crowd, he rebukes them. Do you still not perceive or understand, he says? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets of pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. And he said, do you not yet understand? Well, we know that they didn't. There are actually times when I envy the disciples of their experience of walking and talking and sharing meals with Jesus when he was here among them on the earth. And there are also times when I'm quite grateful that we have the perspective of history and retrospection and knowing the rest of the story. This is one of those times. It's easy for us to judge the disciples harshly, to wonder how on earth could they be so dim? They were right there, standing next to him when he worked all of the miracles. How could they not see that Jesus was truly different and he was not bounded by the limitations that we take for granted? But that might actually be the point. You see, they were so grounded in their knowledge, so certain that they knew how the world worked. And Jesus was like no one they had ever encountered before. Rather than accept the world as it was, Jesus challenged the paradigm and had both the power and ability to change it. Not only that, but he challenged the disciples to not accept the world as their knowledge told them it was, and indeed to be a force of change, for he taught them that they too could change the world. After this, Jesus asked them, "Who do people say I am?" And Peter responded, "Well, you're the Messiah." And Jesus said, "Yes, but don't tell anyone." And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must be arrested and humiliated, that he must be rejected by the leaders and be killed, and then on the third day he would rise again. Now, to the disciples, this must have sounded crazy. For common knowledge, there's that phrase again, said that the Messiah was going to come and fix everything that was wrong with the world. The Messiah was going to be a warrior king, would overthrow the Romans, drive them out of their land, restore Israel to its former glory. Everybody knew this, and it was the fondest hope of all the Jews that the Messiah would come and do this. And now Jesus is saying, yes, hi, I am indeed the Messiah, but he wasn't going to do any of those things. Instead of leading the rebellion, he was going to be hated and beaten. He would accept the shame of the cross and be killed by the very people he was supposed to overthrow. Judged by the lens of their knowledge, this would mean to the disciples that Jesus was not the Messiah. Yet, they had seen the miracles, they had listened to the teaching, and they knew that he was the Messiah, and so they found themselves with quite a conundrum. Either Jesus was the Messiah, or he was just a powerful man who was, let's face it, a bit of a kook. And then Peter, John, and James go with him to the mountaintop, and they witness the transfiguration. Jesus is surrounded by a gleaming white light, and out of nowhere appear Moses and Elijah to confer with Jesus, and a voice from heaven echoes, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him." On the way up the mountain, the disciples must have been puzzled as they were trying to reconcile their image of what the Messiah should be with the reality of what Jesus taught them. And now they are witnesses to another miracle. This time, not one that Jesus is performing, but one that is performed on Jesus himself. They see the Holy Spirit illuminating Jesus and transfiguring him in front of their eyes, and they hear God himself speaking directly to them. Well, this is finally more than enough to convince them that Jesus truly is the Son of God, is the long-awaited Messiah. They are now finally ready to admit that their knowledge has failed them, that they must rely less on what they know and more on what they hear and see and learn from Jesus. So what does this tell us today? Well, sisters, brothers, hear me clearly. We too are Jesus' disciples. Yes, we have the power of history and the perspective to inform us and shape our understanding, but is that enough? For Jesus challenged the disciples to change the world, and that's precisely what they did. After the resurrection, they went to the four corners of the earth and spread Christianity throughout the world in an unprecedented fashion. They learned to rely less upon the knowledge of the world and more upon the knowledge of the risen Christ. Do we do the same? Do we rely more upon the things we know about the world, or do we allow ourselves to trust that God is at work in the world and will enable us to do his will? In a time like the time we're living through, it's tempting to fall back on the knowledge of the world, to embrace the familiar and not open ourselves to the possibilities of change. But Jesus teaches us that while this may seem the safest and the easiest way, it's not his way. Jesus challenges us to look at the world with a fresh set of eyes and embrace other ways of living, other paradigms that could be there. Now, this will be difficult and it'll be unfamiliar, but remember what Jesus said. He will be with us the whole time. And when we do this, my friends, we just might find ourselves changing the world in ways that we never could have imagined.